So this is Ajay Phatak from the Ecological Society, and I have Dr. Lele, Dr. Gurudas Nulkar, and a set of people from these two organizations. Uh, we decided that there were a lot of questions. We have received several questions from the audience after the session on what kind of economy do we want, which was kind of aired a couple of weeks ago. Briefly, these are in the areas of equity, social justice, poverty, externalization of costs and responsibilities, who cares for whom, or the democracy and governance. What are the real constraints? What kind of actions and solutions would you propose or are likely possible? Now, let me suggest, and I would request the participants, seeking the solutions, hold their horses until our last discussion session in January, when we will try and synthesize the way forward, based on having understood some facets of reality from various important perspectives. It will be best to then provide a more holistic suggestion and path on the way forward. Another couple of categories that we have received questions include valuation of natural resources and some related to ecological economics. We have a very interesting category, couple of great questions on can consumption lead to real prosperity? We will try and discuss these between our expert team at A3 and the Ecological Society in the following couple of hours. So let me request Santosh to provide a gist of questions in the first category. So over to you, Santosh.
So there is a question, isn't inequality natural? If yes, then striving for equality is swimming upstream.
So actually, we have been talking about inequality and equality. I would like to change these words to inequity and not really inequality. Now, what does it really mean? I mean, if you look at nature, then all and sundry have an opportunity which is equitable, and that equitable opportunity may or may not translate into equality. So, but the two people will still have the same opportunity, and I think very well explained by Sharad otherwise as well. And moreover, those who around whom the world moves, and basically we're talking about dynamic equilibrium, and dynamic equilibrium essentially means that there will never be equality unless there is gradient, there is no movement, as all of us know. Now, having said that, this aspect of equitable opportunities is most important, and I think that's crucial. So, Gurudas, if you want to add anything to this.
So the question is inequality natural? I mean, so my first question is, what is natural? Do you mean by universal design? Do you mean by the way the earth and the species and the resources are structured? By what way? So if you say by the universal design of the universe, then of course inequality is natural. So Sweden does not have the same resources that Japan has. India does not have the same. Why India? I mean, Pune district doesn't have the same resources that Assam has or Meghalaya has, something else. So inequality in the sense of distribution of resources on the planet and the access to the people is definitely unequal in its sense. The question we are trying to answer is inequality natural in the economic engine? That would be a better way to frame this question. And then inequality is definitely natural in the economic engine, because the economic engine is built upon competition. And when you say competition, what matters is your starting point. If I get 100 crore rupees out of a business, and if Mukesh Ambani gets 100 crore rupees from another business, it's not the same thing. My starting point is way behind Mukesh Ambani's. So therefore, inequality in that sense in the economic engine is built in. And we as human beings, when we are looking at welfare of society as a whole, we are not just looking at individual interests, then we have to overcome this natural inequality. And that is what we are talking about. So one of the things which Ajay brought up is inequity. So the root cause of inequality is inequitable distribution of resources. And there again, economics has no answer. Right? So we have discussed a lot about why economics does not have an answer in inequity. So that's my short answer to this question.
Okay. The next question. We have an indicator to measure poverty. How we can measure prosperity of rich people? Is there any possibility to make cap on it, on the upper side, the prosperity?
Actually, this is a very
Can we have a cap?
interesting question. Yeah, this is a very interesting question. So if you really look at measuring prosperity, currently prosperity is measured in various ways. Sometimes it is your wealth, or sometimes it is your annual income, etc. But if you really want to touch upon or you cap on the divide, so really speaking, we're talking about the difference between the rich and poor, the has and the have-nots. And what you're essentially saying is that if we can we create a cap whereby saying that rich cannot be any richer than this, etc. Right? For example, I just want to quote a very interesting example, and I will leave it at that. Uh, there has been, a second generation entrepreneur who took over from his father and ran a private enterprise in Brazil, where it was not just limited to capping the maximum income in his enterprise. So he essentially said that the ratio between the minimum income and the maximum income, cannot be any different than 1:10. So 10 times richer is the maximum that that enterprise provided for. But the point is not just that. The point is he also inculcated this whole idea of democratic principles within the organization. And if you really look at ability of workers to contribute to how enterprises function, and the enterprise's well-being for that matter. I mean, that was also a very interesting experiment, and it is very well documented in a book called Maverick. So those who are interested in looking at how this experiment was run, I think you can may as well refer to this interesting book called Maverick.
One point to add, I think prosperity should be measured, and my suggestion for measuring prosperity has always been by measuring the ecological footprint of the prosperity. So, and that can be done in proxy. So if I own 20 cars, then my ecological footprint is so and so. So if we shift from measuring the prosperity from a monetary economic system into an ecologic measurement, which is the ecological footprint, that would matter much more. So that would tell how much resource consumption an affluent person has, right? Instead of how much money he has in his bank or how much assets he has under control, under ownership. So my suggestion is prosperity should be measured by ecological footprints, which can be taken by proxy.
Is poverty related to deprivation? If yes, then poverty should not be universal. I think it related to another aspect too, what Amartya Sen talks in capability approach. Sharath sir.
Thank you, Santosh. Yes, I think this is a very important question. Goes back to some of the points that Ajit Ranade also made regarding our need to understand both absolute poverty as a concept, where we say there is a certain universally accepted idea of what is a minimum standard of living, let us say, or minimum standard of well-being that people should have, and people falling below that then becomes the absolute poverty, absolutely poor category. And the issue of inequality, which is about you can have inequality in rich countries as well as inequality in poor countries, and so on. So having said that, this issue of deprivation, see, deprivation has different meanings in different contexts, or different when different people use that word. For example, it can mean that I am depriving you of something. So I think the core question that this person is getting at in here is poverty the outcome of my own actions? If I am poor, is it only because of my action or inaction? Or is it because of somebody else's actions that deprive me of my ability to live above the poverty line or to achieve a certain standard of well-being? And I think what Amartya Sen's work is telling us is a combination of these things. It is saying that as a society, we have to make sure that people have the capabilities to achieve their well-being. It's not necessary that everybody will define well-being in the same way, and it's not necessary that everybody will be able to achieve exactly the same level of well-being. But as a society, we have a responsibility to prevent active deprivation of anybody from achieving their well-being. And therefore, that means the idea of capabilities, the ideas of freedoms. And so Amartya Sen's contribution has been to expand the idea of freedom to go beyond what we consider as political freedom to even the, and on the other hand, economists, or let us say in capitalist society, the focus shifts from political freedom to economic freedom, which then becomes trivialized as the freedom of choice between whether I choose Coca-Cola or Thumbs Up or and so on. That kind of freedom of choice, to the idea that freedom to exercise my rights and my aspirations in multiple spheres of life, whether it is about the quality of my life, whether it is about the physical and material well-being, to pursue my own livelihood in the way I want it. And of course, political freedom, social freedom to have an identity which others will not then persecute me because of that. So these are all the freedoms that Amartya Sen has talked about. And with freedom, for me, comes responsibility for others to give me that freedom, therefore not to deprive me of those freedoms. So the deprivation question is very, very definitely related to my poverty may be the result of you depriving me of those freedoms to get out of poverty.
The next question is to Srushti. What is meant by quality of life by speaker? Is it a thing which can be measured quantitatively or is it subjective? It is for Srushti.
Yeah, I think it's both. So quality of life definitely is a very subjective concept. Quality of life and the way that I define it will be is very dependent on what I value, and depending on what somebody else's priorities are, it will be very different for them. But that doesn't mean that it can't be measured. So there are both qualitative and quantitative ways to measure quality of life, a lot of which have been tried out also. And I think a lot of composite indices that exist today, where we look at multiple indicators, not just one indicator like GDP, but multiple indicators and weigh them out differently to create one score. These kind of indices do look at quality of life also. So in terms of like more conventional definitions of development, quality of life has, in the current discourse at least, come to mean more for everybody. So it is more production of wealth, and it is more access to wealth, and then there is a more equal or equitable distribution of wealth. But there are also emerging alternative definitions of quality of life, a lot of which Ashish actually spoke about in the webinar also, which look at healthier people, people who are less dependent on mainstream economy and markets, happier people, like the Gross National Happiness Index looks at. So there are these other ways also to look at quality of life.
And the next question to you, would you say that GDP serves as an index of the flow of money in society, which may be a very limited indicator of quality of life for present and future generations? And if so, what could be possible indicators of future quality of life, and could this be measurable? The same to add upon.
Just now say that GDP is not a good indicator of quality of life at all. So I will move past that. Since it is limited, what can we look at? This is actually a question that has been addressed by many people in over the last 2 decades. So I have actually made a list of indicators that I can talk about. So if you look at, we spoke about Amartya Sen, and way back when in 94, he came up with the Human Development Index, which looks at indicators for quality of life. And he's looked at things like life expectancy, literacy, escape from preventable morbidity. And like Sharad sir was saying, freedom. So there's freedom from hunger, but there's also personal liberty and freedom to make choices for oneself. So these were the very first indicators for quality of life that came about. Recently, in 2011, the European Union added this thing called 8+1 dimensions of quality of life, where in addition to the indicators in HDI, they also added productivity, which is how time is used, education, not just as a function of literacy, but education as what is actually done with the education that you receive, leisure and social interactions, which is one of the first indicators that has kind of moved away entirely from contribution to economy and GDP, and is now looking at well-being as a product of how much free time do we have, how do we use it, how are we interacting with people around us and our communities. And it also introduced for the first time in like major discourse the idea that our natural living environment and our relationship with it is a direct contributor to our quality of life. So moving from there, if you look at the GNH, the Gross National Happiness Index, they also have a very comprehensive list of indicators that looks at not just quality of life, but also the larger picture of well-being. And in addition to these indicators, they also have now looked at psychological well-being, which going back to the first question of how these things are measured. So some of this is self-reporting. Things like psychological well-being are self-reported, but larger things like health can also be looked at through data from health systems in a country. Then the GNH also looks at community vitality, which looks at how much are you really in touch with your community, and how are you adding and contributing to your immediate community. And they've also looked at diversity and resilience in both cultural and ecological contexts. So in the cultural context, it looks at, do you know your local language? Are you connected to your local culture in tangible ways? And for ecological diversity and resilience, it is measuring essentially a sense of responsibility towards the natural environment. So I think that there's all of these different kinds of indicators that today exist and are currently measured for when it comes to well-being and quality of life. And I just wanted to leave everyone with this quick thought, where the World Economic Forum in 2018 actually reported that most citizens like you and me don't really measure or evaluate their own country's progress based on GDP. We actually tend to look at how our own standard of living has improved and changed over time. And for that, things such as income, what kind of opportunities of employment are available, economic security, and quality of life measured in all these kinds of ways matters. So to move from GDP towards indicators of well-being is relatively easy on a feasibility scale. It's more systems of current politics and the larger question that we have to deal with.
Which of the pressing problem of the world has been solved by economics to yield justice, dignity, liberty, and equality? Hunger, shelter, intolerance, health, unsustainability, environmental destruction, climate crisis. And a couple of questions in line with that. What principles of economics build symbiotic relationships, not exploitative ones? And who is in charge of the economy, and who are the beneficiaries of the economy?
This is a very interesting set of questions. It could take us a whole set of lectures to get into the details, but let me just try to very briefly touch upon some of the key points that are being. I think very interesting questions here. I think we need to first of all understand that when we say economics, what do we mean? Because there are two versions of economics, at least, or two ways of thinking about economics as a descriptive discipline, a discipline which simply explains how the world works, and a prescriptive discipline, what somebody would call normative economics. Welfare economics is part of that stream, which is actually prescribing how a government or in fact people should actually operate. And they are of course interconnected, but they are not the same. And so in a sense, descriptive economics does not solve any problems. It only describes how the world works, and then somebody might use that understanding to figure out how to solve the problem, whether it is hunger, poverty, or war for that matter. Further, we need to understand that when we say economics today, the predominant voice in economics today is that of neoclassical economics. And neoclassical economics is the invention or a certain stream that has emerged and become extremely powerful in the last 100 years or so. It has gained predominance over all other forms or other ways of understanding the economic world. And in fact, it claims hegemony over not only the economic transactions that people make, but even social transactions. So neoclassical economists say they can explain divorce, they can explain intra-family disputes, They can explain the question of gender also through economic theory, which is neoclassical economic theory. And neoclassical economic theory has very serious limitations because it describes people, or it makes assumptions about people and how they behave in a very, very narrow sense as individual, fully informed, profit maximizing or utility maximizing. So profit maximizing producers and utility maximizing consumers, where implicitly utility is increased when consumption increases. Consumption of material goods and services increases, your utility increases. Neoclassical economics cannot explain a situation where people's utility increases because of altruism, by donating money, by helping somebody else who is in trouble, or being emotional about your family. These aspects are not really explainable through the perspective of neoclassical economics. Therefore, neoclassical economics, as the sort of most dominant form of economics today, has not really helped us solve any of these problems that this person is mentioning in this question, because the ideas of dignity, liberty, equality and justice are, as Ajit Ranade also mentioned, are orthogonal to the whole discussion in neoclassical economics. And neoclassical economics tries to bypass that whole discussion, saying we focus on growth and let somebody else focus on the distributional aspect. But implicit in their whole assumption about that is the sanctity of private property. And when private property is distributed in a highly skewed manner, the growth that accumulates with, on the basis of that kind of a property rights regime is automatically going to be skewed. If I am already the owner of capital and I get 15% return on capital, then my income is going to increase much more disproportionately as compared to somebody who does not have any capital at all and only has their two hands to do labor to earn any income whatsoever. So neoclassical economics, by trying to bypass the question of distribution of property rights, perpetuates the current distribution of property rights and therefore perpetuates inequality rather than even addressing that question of inequality, dignity. All these questions are foreign to neoclassical economics. And by keeping those questions out, in a sense, it devalues those questions. And by claiming to actually have the hegemony in the social sciences by saying we have predictive power because we have mathematical models, we have analytical tools which no other discipline has, and so on and so forth. It has a kind of a created a hawa that somehow it is the right discipline. It is the physics of social sciences, and it can explain everything. And therefore, policymakers should listen only to that version of their explanation of reality and their predictions and so on. So I think a short answer is that it has not really solved. It has aggravated problems of justice, dignity. Neoclassical economics has aggravated problems of justice, dignity, liberty, equality. It does not believe in the idea of symbiotic relationships. By definition, the core assumption of neoclassical economics is that people are competitive, profit maximizers. My profit comes at your cost. I don't really care about it. I don't care about you. That is a fundamental assumption. I don't have any caring about somebody else. And the hidden hand of the market will somehow make things work in a way that everybody benefits through the idea of economic growth and so on. And the final point, therefore, about who's in charge of the economy and the beneficiaries. As I said, we live in a capitalist world. We live in a capitalist society, and neoclassical economics, as I said, by not questioning the distribution of property or the ideas embedded in capitalism about capital, that somebody who owns capital is legitimately allowed to have return to that capital, is further propagating the same ideas. That and therefore, who controls the economy? It is the capitalists who control the economy. They even control the government that sets economic policy. And our political system, unfortunately, has moved more and more in the direction of allowing those with greater economic power to influence the political system through, for example, the electoral bonds in India, or through the donations that happen in the American political system, and the kind of lobbying that takes place. So definitely, the political sphere and the economic sphere are controlled by those who have economic power.
The other major part which neoclassical economics has overlooked, or rather forgotten, is the informal economy. And that is completely overlooked. And informal economy has been reduced to a non-existent economy, what is called as shadow economy by Ivan Illich. And that's a very important part of human society, which does not even come into play in the economist thought circle. And so that was one point. And the other point I wanted to make about the symbiotic relation. What kind of symbiosis does the neoclassical economics look at? The only symbiotic relationship that neoclassical economics looks at is the producer-consumer relationship. So it's purely by that one lens that neoclassical economics looks at, and which has created all these problems that Sharad was just talking about.
I'll move to the next question. That is quite interesting. It is pertaining to the present migration issue, which was happening because of COVID, and the decentralization issue, which Ashish sir, everybody talked, all the speakers. The question is, sir, talking about equality, why economy is excelling only in cities, making them smarter, even though they are exploding? And on the other hand, why decentralization of economy at taluka level is not happening in our country, where all the needs, into bracket not wants, from basic needs, jobs, etc., all is taken care at taluka level, so that people don't have to leave their hometown and go to cities.
Well, again, a very challenging question to answer in a few minutes, but here we need to understand both that there are faults in economic policy, but there is also a certain other dimension to the whole idea of modern industrial revolution driven developmental cycle, right? So we are passing through an era of, let us say, starting from the industrial revolution, where fossil fuel driven mechanization and factories that function on the basis of those kinds of technologies have come to the fore, and those factories operated at a certain scale. Handlooms are in everybody's house, but power looms cannot be in everybody's house. So that's a simple example of how, when you have a fossil fuel driven technological solution to the idea of weaving, it tries to go to a larger and larger scale, and it in a sense co-evolves with the idea of capitalism to then say that we should have a textile factory which will employ 1,000 people. That is much more economical than those employing in one household handloom kind of thing. And this movement of industrialization and the technologies that have evolved after the industrial revolution have necessitated the growth of cities, because then it's much easier to have all the industries in the same locality, because then they are dependent on each other for ancillary inputs and so on and so forth. So you have this natural clustering of industrial activity in certain locations for historical, geographical, and other kinds of reasons, and the sucking away of essentially laborers from rural areas into those cities, concomitant with the deprivation of those workers from their areas. So as Marx pointed out in the English context, or the enclosure of commons, or in the Indian context, for example, the taking away of forest rights, taking away of land rights from Adivasis or other people, and therefore, in a sense, forced migration. So there's a pull effect. The industry being in the city attracts labor there, but labor is created first by separating people from their land. Otherwise they would have stayed there and worked on their land. So this combination of push and pull, push them off the land, pull them into the cities, is how you get huge concentrations of largely impoverished people coming to cities looking for jobs. And of course, you have an elite that builds on that whole industrial system, the kind of well-paying jobs that many of us are working in.
The next question, sir. Since there are a lot of questions on the effects of population on the environment, isn't population often used as a proxy for class, caste?
Again, a difficult and complicated question to answer, but we need to understand that a demographic transition has happened across the world, right? It happened in the industrial countries first, and it's happening in India now in the form of the life expectancy going from 20 years to 40 years to now 60 years and above, which means people are living 3 times as long as on an average than they were living earlier in the, let's say, pre-industrial period, which means you're going to have a much larger number of people, sort of a standing stock of people, and infant mortality going down. Therefore, but the fertility rates do not transit so dramatically to replacement fertility. They start at 6 and then slowly drop to 2 over a century or more. If you look at how transitions took place in the Western world, they did not become overnight, come down to replacement fertility. So the population boom is a natural consequence at some level of the kind of changes in medical technology and human prosperity that have occurred in the last 100, 200 years. It's happened everywhere. They had the option of pushing their surplus population onto so-called less populated continents, Australia, North America, wipe out the indigenous communities, and then colonize the whole area, whole continent, and so on and so forth. Obviously, a country like India didn't have that option. So then we are facing that burden of the growing population ourselves. So this is one level of explanation. The second level clearly is that this demographic transition has already occurred in the upper class, but does not occur in the lower class. So when we say, isn't population an excuse for caste and class, I think what the question means, or how I understand the question, is that because of the levels of deprivation created by caste and class, we have a whole number of people at the bottom who do not have the capacity to carry out a demographic transition. They don't have the economic capacity, they don't have access to healthcare, they don't have access to reproductive health in particular. They cannot afford to have less children, because where is the social security for them? Where is that pension fund that will take care of them after the age of 60 when they have stopped being able to earn? Who will take care of them, right? So therefore, the tendency to have children as a social security measure, the role of gender in that, till you have a male child, you will keep on having children, because it's only the male child who will supposedly give you social security after you have retired or you have become aged. So all these factors play into the dominance of patriarchy also means that women are prevented from accessing reproductive health care or birth control devices of the kind that would not be repressive to their bodies. So a variety of caste, class, and gender factors prevent the demographic transition from taking place rapidly enough. Whereas the demographic transition is sort of a fact of life in the context of medical technological change. So that would be my response.
I would like to add one very interesting point, and it is in the context of the impact of population on environment and who is really responsible. So in fact, in the 2017 Oxfam study provides a very interesting answer. And it says that around 10% of the population worldwide is responsible for 50% of consumption, which essentially means that, give or take 50% of your footprint, ecological footprint. And that's huge, which essentially means that the responsibility towards conservation, towards what really are the impacts, shifts really purely from population to consumption. And I just wanted to add to what Sharad's perspective, which was more from a social perspective to also environmental perspective.
The next question to Sharad sir. When there is huge inequality of income in India, why the higher income groups are not taxed heavily?
So this goes back to the point made earlier as to who controls the economic system, including the political system, in a sense. The economic and political system being closely tied. It is the political system which is supposed to act as a brake on too much economic inequality, right? For example, by passing taxation laws that will try to redress a little bit of that balance. But if the political system is beholden to the richest class in society, then they would only follow policies that are acceptable to the richest class. So as you have seen in India from 91 onwards, in the name of liberalization and so on, the marginal tax rates have been brought down from what used to be maybe excessively high 90% marginal tax rate, marginal mind you, at the topmost level of your income, to 50% and now to 30%. So this refusal to tax people at a higher level, even on income which is clearly not at all required for any reasonable person, for any reasonable level of let's say quality of life. So I think people have not yet discussed this question of what is a reasonable income that a person should have, and that any income above that is quite okay to tax heavily, and understand the reason why we are taxing heavily. There is neither a sort of a discourse on that, and the powerful classes will never allow us to have that discourse to the extent that they will try to influence the whole discussion in the political sphere. And so this is our challenge really, that to regain control of our political system, given the inequalities in society. And mind you, these are economic, these are also caste related inequalities, these are also various other kinds of inequalities that we have to all liberate the political system from, or limit the influence of.
There are a few questions on the externalization of costs and responsibilities. I would like to request Dr. Gurudas Nulkar to answer a few of these. The first one, Gurudas sir, is wastes created in the ecosystem due to development and economic activity is never spoken of or taken into account when speaking of GDP. who is to take the responsibilities for that cost?
Most certainly the producer and the consumer. You cannot put the responsibility solely on the producer because he's finally producing for the market demand. So when I'm buying a car, I must be held responsible for the smoke it is emitting as much as the car company should be held responsible for making a contraption which produces smoke. So externalities in economics are extremely difficult to assign to somebody because of this problem. You know, the buyer seller both are equally responsible because the demand is by the consumer and the production is by the producer. So ecologists have always said that the externality has to be taxed on the producer, but purely by environmental value system and ethics, you will notice that the buyer is equally responsible for buying the contraption. One of the problems which happens is that the market is never perfect. So we are operating in an imperfect market. And what happens when we buy something in an imperfect market is we do not know the consequences of our purchase. So if I am made aware of the entire consequences of my purchase, then I might take a decision to benefit the environment or to benefit society. So I might choose not to buy some things which I feel are environmentally harmful, or I might choose not to buy some things which have been socially harmful. But because of this imperfect economy, because of this imperfect market, I do not have this complete information. So information asymmetry plays a huge role in externalization of costs also.
Right. Yes.
And there is a concept of this, transparency, radical transparency, what they call. And most of the producers do not really abide by that. And that's why, as a consumer, I kind of land up consuming blindly without really me even realizing that I am impacting environment, I'm impacting, natural resource base, depleting it, etc. So I think there is some responsibility specifically on the producers to be able to, transparently provide that information so that, consumer can actually make his or her choice appropriately.
Yeah, I also feel one thing here, other than producer, even the advertising and all, because advertising is not directly related to the producer, it comes later part. And even that is also very much linked to what consumer buys. Like,
yeah, so
also
when we say producer, it's a proxy for the entire value chain. And
Exactly.
advertising agencies and marketers are part of the value chain. You're right.
Even the use and throw consumerism kind of thing that would be impacting the things, right, sir? We are using more and more because of the use and throw.
Yeah, I think the point of linear economy versus circular economy, etc. We can always debate on, but I think we have been talking about a much larger question and not just about the economy the way it is structured, and whether just the restructuring of economy can solve the problem, right? So we have been talking about the fact that it's not just about restructuring economy. We have to question why economy the way we see it today.
The next question again is for you, Gurudas. Can you explain sustainable forestry?
Yeah, so sustainable forestry is a very funny concept, and it's a very economic concept. And the word sustainability came up in forestry for the first time. That is the time when forestry was used, and that's because timber was a basis of a lot of economic activities, including paper, pulp, rayon, firearms, war equipment. All of that required carriages and so on and so forth. So as the consumption of timber started increasing, the people started realizing that we are depleting our forests. So what do we do? So can we do an agriculture of forest? So to put it very simply, that is what sustainable forestry meant, which means you start planting new trees which are timber, which are yielding good quality timber, and start taking them out, harvesting them, as soon as they reach the size of the timber which is required by the industry. And this was called as sustainable forestry. So it's not actually forestry at all. It is sustainable plantation. And sustainable for whom? Sustainable for industrial consumption, not sustainable for the ecology, not sustainable for the environment, not sustainable for human beings, but sustainable for the industry. And what is the meaning of sustainable here is that the raw material will not be stopped. You will get a continuous supply of timber as a raw material. And that is what sustainable forestry is.
So that means sustainable forestry, when you connect it only for communities, then it works. But when you connect it with industry, it doesn't work. Is that so?
Yeah, for communities, it holds a completely different connotation. And there you don't call it sustainable forestry at all. I mean, so forestry and non-timber forest produce, which were used by indigenous tribes, were always sustainable. You know, every Adivasi community has their own way of sustaining resources. So, for example, the Koi community does not go out in the breeding season of the fish. Pregnant female deer are not hunted by Fase Parthis and by the Naidu community. So there is a whole way of that they are sustaining their natural resources. But sustainable forestry came into play when the requirement of timber in industry started growing. So therefore, sustainable forestry in industrial approach, in economic approach, and sustainable forestry in traditional and indigenous communities and subsistence economy has a completely different connotation. It's not the same.
So now let us go towards democracy and governance, which is really a favorite subject of most of us. So I'd like to ask Dr. Lele about, the question that we got, one of the interesting questions that we got is, what gives anyone the right to plead or fight for any other than self?
Okay, so I think this question is coming in the context of the idea that urban Naxalism is rife and people are doing all kinds of things, false things on behalf of the others and so on and so forth. Sort of the denigration of the idea of public service. Because I think the right in a democracy, my right is not only to look out for myself. There is a responsibility, in fact, not just that I have a right to speak on behalf of those who are deprived, but there is in fact a responsibility on me to speak on the behalf of those who cannot speak for themselves. So if you just look at how the Indian Supreme Court liberalized the idea of locus standi in the 1980s onwards, when we had the Bhagalpur blindings. So these are prisoners, under trial prisoners in a prison in Bhagalpur who have been blinded by their jailer. Now, if you say that, well, I can only speak for myself, but the Bhagalpur prisoner who has been blinded can never speak for himself. He's been blinded and he's in prison. So how is he going to speak for himself? So the Supreme Court, in fact, expanded the idea of local standard to say, if they got a postcard from somebody in the prison, that postcard became a case. That postcard became a writ petition, got the status of a writ petition. So what the Supreme Court was telling us is that there is going to be a lot of people who cannot access, for instance, just one example, the justice system on their own, because they are not only just deprived, they are actually chained, jailed, blinded, on the verge of getting killed, thrown out of their house, whatever it may be. Now, who will speak for them? So there is a responsibility on all of us to actually look and help anybody who is deprived of the right to freedom, right to speech, right to redressal in the judicial system, or right to make a claim of the economic system and the political system. A simple example as, if I lift somebody who is handicapped and help them to go to the political booth. It's a very simple and a very trivial act at some level, but that is essentially an expression of the idea that we have a responsibility to actually help those who cannot exercise their rights. And as I said, not just the political rights, freedom of speech, freedom of to live, freedom to exercise a livelihood, all these spheres, we have to speak for others. And I say we, especially the elite class. And I think all of us at some level here in this conversation, belong to an elite class. We are the top 10%, top 5%, top 1% of Indian society. And there's a moral responsibility on us to speak for that. That may include all the way to even those non-human organisms who cannot speak for themselves. It can mean future generations who cannot speak for themselves. So we can expand the idea of whom to speak for. Of course, it can lead to trivialities. It can lead to public interest litigation that is, shall we say, frivolous and so on and so forth. But that is the responsibility of any system, judicial, political, administrative, to weed out some of these spurious attempts to distract when so many vibrant issues are in need of being addressed.
Yeah. So somebody here wants to know.
I would just like to add over here that when even now, when there's a lot of discussion around the Dalit rape that happened a few days ago, when celebrities join the conversation, there's always a question of why is she there to talk about this? She is neither Dalit, she has not experienced these problems. Why should she get the stage or the space to talk about this? But again, like Sharad sir, you were saying, it's everyone's responsibility to talk about these different issues and participate so that we make the world a better place.
And just adding to what Sharad said, on several occasions, Supreme Court has very generously interpreted the right to life. And when somebody in my area is deprived of something, it does affect me directly or indirectly. And that gives the authority for me to plead on his or her behalf, be it a human being or a non-human being or a river. It can be a river. I can plead on behalf of the river. So a very generously interpretation in several times, not just once. Supreme Court has done it multiple times.
And I also feel that it's not in just my area, it can be any area. Like, I don't have to say that, no, this is not your area, so you don't have a right to speak here, or for somebody like, who is not belonging to your caste or your community or whatever.
No, in fact, by the idea of citizenship is the idea that we are all citizens, we are all on par with each other, and we can speak for each other. And in fact, the idea of global citizenship means that we can speak for anybody living in any part of the world.
Yeah,
that's the core idea. Although citizenship is somewhat narrowly translated into citizens of nations, but we are also at some level global citizens, right?
And that we are all living off shared resources.
Yes.
So there's one more question which says, like, what are your views on quintessential context, that is master-slave morality in terms of governance and
Well, I'm not absolutely sure I understand the question. In today's context, don't think anybody is actually supporting the idea of slavery. I hope not. So maybe I should just go back to the idea of equality. So a lot of people feel that, yeah, well, fine, slavery is a little extreme, but there is always going to be inequality in society, and why are we making such a big ruckus about the idea of inequality and constantly talking about equity and justice? And I think Ajay made a very nice point in one of our conversations that there is equity and there is inequality, or there are other sociologists and social theorists who have talked about the idea of equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome. So at the very least, we should all agree that there needs to be an equality of opportunity in specific context. Now, suppose you say, ki, Baba, I want to be able to jump 6 feet high, but I am actually handicapped. Then, give me the opportunity to do a high jump which is 6 feet high. That may be a irrelevant context. But here we are talking, when we say opportunity, we mean the opportunity to live life as a citizen of a country or a society, political freedom, all the things that we talked about, the freedoms that Amartya Sen talks about. So opportunity to exercise those freedoms. And we need to be able to give everybody that opportunity, not discriminate between man and woman, person born in this caste or that caste. The whole idea of caste itself is a social construct which is completely cooked up, or for that matter, discriminate on the basis of color, discriminate on the basis of religion, and so on and so forth. So in what context are we saying opportunity where those discriminatory ideas do not matter? The idea of equality of opportunity does not say that there has to be equality of outcome. For example, that you will never have any entrance exam to any college, and you will never choose anybody on the basis of merit. That is not the idea of, but it is seriously questioning how today we determine merit. So when I, for example, run JEE and then so many people go somewhere and get 2 years of coaching and so on and so forth, what does it really, what is JEE in IITs really doing? Is it really measuring merit? There are a lot of studies to show that the JEE rank is not at all correlated with people's performance in IIT, or for that matter, their performance earlier. there are studies which show that performance in these kinds of exams a very poor reflection on people's creative abilities, on people's so many things. So the idea of merit itself is being questioned. It's also being questioned that your ability to perform in a certain exam is going to be, if it is going to be determined by your ability to pay 3 years of fees to some coaching class in Kota, Rajasthan, then that's hardly a fair measure of merit, because somebody may simply not have access to those coaching classes because they don't have the money. So then what happened to your whole idea of merit? You're now measuring what is merit that is achievable by some people who are privileged, and not achievable almost by definition by those who are deprived. And I think it's in this context that we need to understand these ideas of equality of opportunity. They are not simply saying, okay, fine, there's a ticket set at a gate to a cricket stadium, and anybody can buy the ticket. That is just a very primitive idea of equality of opportunity. Is that ticket affordable? Who was able to stand in line at 5 a.m. in the morning and get that ticket at 12 noon, and who wasn't able to do so for whatever reasons of constraints? So these are all the things that we need to factor in when we talk about equality of opportunity.
There's somebody who feels that today's democracy is a sham. So at best, it can be called particracy, and we as people don't know which party to vote for, because one is a thief and the other one is a criminal. So it is more like a netagiri question. So he wants to know whether with neocolonial greedy aspirations of politicians and MNCs, what other results can one expect?
I think it's a rhetorical question.
Yes, maybe it's a rhetorical question. I think largely it's a rhetorical question that, it is at best a particracy and so on. Absolutely true. But I think the question is, A, do we have an option of saying we don't want a democracy? Or is the real option to say, how do we improve the democracy? And there are, hundreds of things that we can try to do to improve the quality of the democracy. Just the fact of being a democratic country, on paper, does not automatically translate into practice. And I think Ajit and Ashish, both in their own words, were saying this thing, that active citizen involvement at every level, in every sphere of life, is the only way to make this democracy more meaningful, more reflective of people's aspirations, and not a particracy or a kleptocracy or a netacracy in that sense, or a criminalocracy in that sense. So I think that it is a rhetorical question because there are no other options. Although we tend to often say, oh well, Bharat mein to sirf, we need a king, or we need a monarch, or we need a dictatorship. जब इंदिरा गांधी ने emergency declare किया तो train right time चल रही थी, and government offices were running, opening on time. I mean, this is a very childish interpretation of how we should run our life and our political system. So,
yeah. There's somebody who wants to know, what is the biggest threat to environment, political economy or the economic polity? Though it is difficult to make a distance between the both, however, one feels that there is a fine line that divides the two, hence the question.
I'm not absolutely sure how the person who has said the question is making that fine distinction between these two terms, political economy and economic polity, right? If the idea is that the economic sphere is obviously not operating in the way that neoclassical economics assumes of, perfect competition, perfect information, all consumers are equal, all producers are equal, nobody can dominate, etc., etc. And the political sphere is also not functioning in the way we think of a democratic sphere to function. Both of these are responsible for environmental degradation, because the economic sphere is ensuring that we consume more than we require, and that the production is happening without attention to its environmental impacts. And the political sphere is not able to put in policies or put in measures to regulate the economic sphere. So in a sense, there's no point in making this distinction, because in fact, when we teach environmental social science or ideas of sustainable development, we say that we should stop looking for monocausal answers or explanations, that only political economy is responsible, or only the democratic system or the political system is responsible. It's a combination of a variety of factors, structural factors, for example, patriarchy, gender, caste, they all play a role in depriving certain people of freedoms and imposing environmental costs on some people at the benefit of other people. And we also have to look inwards in our value systems. We have to look to the technologies that we have evolved. So there are multiple causes that result in environmental degradation, of which the political system and economic system are clearly very significant factors, and there's no need to kind of cast them in opposition. They're working in tandem in most cases.
Okay, there's a comment which says that democracy cannot be negotiation of power. So what are your thoughts on that?
Again, a slightly cryptic question, not easy to make out what is in the mind of the questioner. You see, democracy is defined or characterized in different ways, but it is essentially a negotiation. It is a negotiation of different value systems. It is a negotiation of different views as to what will solve our problems. So both the definition of a problem and the solution of the problem are being negotiated in the democratic space, in the ideal world, right? In the ideal world, that negotiation would not be driven by or influenced by inequalities of power, other than political power. I mean, in a sense, if once we adopt a democratic system, at the end of the day, if I belong to a majority party, then our views on what is the problem and what are the solutions will prevail. And in fact, a good democracy puts limits on majoritarianism. It doesn't go only by a majority wins kind of principles. It put limits on majoritarianism. But at the end of the day, those numbers will count in some way towards that decision making. The challenge, of course, is that democracy in reality is always a negotiation between people with different kinds of power, and it may be political power of sheer numbers. It may be economic power of the kind of lobbying or funds that they have at their disposal when they contest the elections. It could be rhetorical power, it could be oratorial power, it could be power of ideas, various things that are, in a sense, some people have information, other people don't. So then the discussion is really imbalanced. So in an ideal democracy, yes, we would hope that the negotiation is on the basis of ideas and reflecting a certain amount of majority views, but with a limit to majoritarianism. And in reality, of course, that doesn't happen because of the presence of power imbalances. So constantly our struggle is to try to limit the imbalances of power.
In a world of deliberating climate catastrophe, how will the narrative of growth radically adjust and adapt to this reality? Will we in the city of Mumbai, sitting at the edge of destruction to rising sea level and floods, etc., talk only about collective aspirations and keep constructing more monuments, etc., or will the state, democracy, choose to project and prepare ahead of the projects? All citizens are securing a good quality of life rather than subjugating it to their individual consumeristic aspirations.
So I think it is not a question of how will the narrative of growth adapt. I think the question is for us, how will we redefine our notions of development, right? Because there are a whole bunch of people who have built their lives and their well-being on building a narrative of growth. And in fact, the whole capitalist system is built on this idea of growth, idea that I can demand a constant return to capital. Which nowhere in the world does any system really exist which can give you 15% growth rate or even 5% growth rate, indefinitely. But this constant demand for a return on capital and a constant demand for economic growth is the fundamental character of today's economic thinking and the system that we have created that promotes this thinking. So it is going to be up to us to challenge that narrative and change that narrative. Nobody is going to change it on their own.
So is there something called social capitalism?
Well, as we know, the world has experimented with a whole variety of things. I mean, even our constitution says that we are committed to a somewhat socialist republic, not a purely capitalist system. And people experimented from, the extreme individual capitalism of the US to communism in Soviet Russia and China. And all of them are mixtures of various kinds. And even in the US, there is something called Medicare. Even in the US, there are various systems that the state has put in place to meet some basic provide some basic public goods. So there is never a system where there's absolutely no role for the state, and it never can be. The debate has always been about what is the role and how much of a role and so on and so forth. And the European systems have been sort of tilted towards a socialist democracy where you allow for private property but limit the excesses of private property through high rates of taxation at the upper end of the spectrum. So that's been their model in many of Scandinavian countries and so on and so forth. So people have experimented with a variety of these systems. Is there something called social capitalism? Yes, I think Scandinavian countries are an example of a sort of an attempt to keep capitalism within humane boundaries. Have they succeeded? And have they succeeded at the cost of others outside Scandinavia? For instance, in an environmental context, they are hugely still drawing upon the resources from outside their country. So Norway, for instance, has very good internal policies, social policies, health policies, educational policies, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, it's hugely drawing upon resources from elsewhere, or destroying the future in that sense, right? So just because they are socialist democracies doesn't mean they have solved all the problems. But we do have examples of socialism, that have succeeded in the world. Yeah.
There's always a doubt that, localized rights strategy is stated by Mahatma Gandhi in Gram Swaraj going to hamper economy?
Yes, but the question is why is the economy sacrosanct, right? Why is the economy sacrosanct?
Yeah.
And is the Gram Swaraj policy, would it have actually enabled a better balance between the need for livelihoods and the need for social stability, or the need for community, the need for more environmentally sound production? Because to put economy at the top and say, well, if some system comes in the way of economic growth, then that's kind of missing the whole point. And I think a lot of that debate that we had in the first session between Ashish and Ajit was about whether economic growth is even a necessary or a sufficient driver of human well-being at the end of the day. And if you really think about it, economic growth really seems to be completely irrelevant to the question of achieving human well-being in a well-rounded and a holistic sense, keeping in mind needs of future generations as well as intra-generational equity. So I think that question needs to be recast in the sense of, is Gram Swaraj feasible in the context of certain technologies, in the context of certain social needs? For instance, you could argue that, well, Gram Swaraj can very easily get converted into Khap Panchayats. And if you look at Haryana, you look at Bihar, you look at so many parts of the country where, yes, there is a certain kind of Gram Swaraj because the elite run the whole show, and the outside world has absolutely no say in what's going on there. The people living there themselves don't have any say. The lower caste don't have any say. The women don't have any say. These Khap Panchayats are running the show. That is a Gram Swaraj of certain kind, but obviously we don't want Gram Swaraj to degenerate into Khap Panchayats. So those are the challenges that we should, I think, really be asking.
For that matter, Sharad, for that matter, the Gram Swaraj envisioned by Mahatma Gandhi actually is talking about well-being of people. I don't even think that this whole question has to be turned around to figure out whether that Gram Swaraj concept can be useful in creating better well-being of people, rather than getting economy as a word in picture at all.
Yeah, absolutely.
The next set of questions is again about constraints and what real constraints are. The statement that someone from the audience made is, economy has to change fundamentally to progress within the planetary boundaries so that both economy and environment can do well. What do you think about this? And Gurudas sir, if you could take this. Is this possible? How this could be?
Yeah, so this is also part of the solutions which we are going to talk about in the last session, I think. Right? Because this does not have a small answer which we can do.
Yeah, and more important part is, we have discussed about something which is broader than just economy and environment, or environment, right? So we said that, let's try to go one step above and ask the question, why economy? And if we say that economy is for the purpose of well-being, then I think we start looking at this whole concept differently. And therefore, if we probably need to restructure something drastically, probably yes, but how? I think we'll, as Gurudas pointed out, we will probably take it up in our last session.
I'll take the next set of questions. These are about constraints and what the real constraints are. It asks, where does the degrowth narrative fit in this conversation or in this context? Is there any merit in placing hopes on the degrowth movement as a possible path to strive towards for the future? And so would that mean reimagining the economy entirely?
So, in the first glance, people have always frowned upon this whole idea of degrowth, and especially the economists, as you can always imagine. But if you again, go back to this Oxfam report, which talks about 10% consuming 50% or 1% consuming 30%, etc., you will easily realize that there is degrowth required somewhere. No, at a global scale, there is absolutely need for degrowth. If you look at the amount of energy that we consume today, can we really sustain this for even next 30, 40 years? The answer probably is no, right? So degrowth is absolutely needed. But at the national scale, or not necessarily limiting this to India per se, but at maybe many different nations which are on the development path, it is more important to look at what we must grow and what we must shrink. So if we focus on distributive justice and well-being and not really bother about whether we grow or shrink, that might be an interesting way to look at this whole narrative of degrowth. So I would request maybe Sharad and Gurudas also to comment on this particular question.
Gurudas, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, so degrowth is something which is very economic in nature, and that's because the way the capitalism is framed, it's all about taking a risk on investing the capital. And if I'm taking a risk on investing my capital into a business, then I need to have growth. So the fundamental principle of capitalist economy is growth. And if we want to say degrowth, then we are actually challenging the way our economy is structured and capitalist economy. So Paul Ehrlich's equation, I equal to PAT, which is impact on the environment is equal to population, affluence, and technology, is a very nice placeholder for understanding how the capital. But I would always like to add to I equal to PAT. I always say that there should be an I and another I which says inequality. So those who have access to technology and those who are affluent, like Sharad said earlier, when they have the power to invest the money, only then can they see the benefits of growth. So actually the common people are not at all involved in the growth part of it at all. So for example, over about 50% of the Indians who are the small and marginal farm holders or the landless farmers, they do not have the growth as anywhere. They don't have growth in their dictionary. So when we are talking about degrowth, we are actually talking about a few people in the country who are experiencing this growth phenomena, and especially those who are based in the cities. So yeah, I mean, but degrowth is something which will challenge the way that the capitalistic economy is structured and the way the governance is being influenced by the capitalistic economy.
I think I'll just add to that by saying that the reason why the word degrowth sparks certain amount of misgivings in the global south, including countries like India, is if you're really concerned about, let us say, the absolutely marginalized, absolutely deprived populations, you can say that some level of increase in the material throughput in their lives is required, perhaps, right? So if somebody living in an absolutely ramshackle jhopdi, and tomorrow under Indira Awas Yojana or some other scheme, they want to build a house of bricks and a pakka roof, in a sense, they have increased their material consumption. And if you have millions or crores of such people in that situation, for them, you can argue that a certain kind of material growth is important. But the degrowth ideas originated in the West, in Europe, and a little bit in the US catching on, where it is saying we are way above that, those kinds of not just thresholds, but even standards of well-being that you would say is adequate, and therefore you need to cut back on your material throughput. That's the core idea of degrowth. It's interesting that, for example, in the Indian context, what scholars have done is recast this idea as post-growth, which says that. So my good friend Professor Rajeshwari Rena, held a conference in Delhi with the title Degrowth, but when the proceedings came out, they decided to call it post-growth ideas, because in a sense, growth is irrelevant to our discussion about development. And so making growth irrelevant and talking really about development, what kind of development do we want, for whom we want it, how we want it, are the core questions. So
there's something like slowing down movement in Europe. Is it something related to this? Slow down movement or something like that, which is going on in Europe. Is it related?
Fast food ke bajaye slow food.
Slow
ideas. Yeah, slow down everything.
Even in policies and all, they are suggesting something like that. There's a huge group which is working on these.
Well, there's obviously many people in terms of numbers, but unfortunately, as a percentage, still very, very small. So their capacity to influence is, I think, still limited. I hope that capacity increases. But yes, it's part of this idea of degrowth.
The next question was directed at Ashish sir. But Sharat sir, if you could help us understand that, or if you could fill us in on that. The question asks is, what is the economic model where material prosperity and environment sustainability could go together?
Well, I think that to ask that question only in terms of what is the economic model is going to be limiting ourselves, because in a sense, as I also said earlier, that it has to be a combination of many structural changes, of which the economic structure is one of them. Clearly, we need to move away from a capitalist model of the economy. What replaces that? Is it Gram Swaraj? Is it? But we clearly first need to think of moving away, which means more and more resources are held as commons, held as public property, not as private property. There are limits to what we can claim as returns to private property, and so on and so forth. So instead of putting a kind of a simple label on it, we will become socialist, yes, that might be a direction that we need to go in. But because of certain baggage, historical baggage, socialism has its own failures and so on and so forth. It would be limiting ourselves or our imaginations if we just use some simple labels to replace capitalism. We need to have fundamental changes in our economic system, concomitantly with changes in our political system. Ashish's point about decentralized democracy, a true participatory democracy, not just a representative democracy, changes in the social sphere in terms of moving away from so many of these structures that we have inherited, whether it is of caste or patriarchy and so on. All these movements have to happen simultaneously. I don't think we can, again, limit ourselves to saying we will have a more environmentally sustainable outcome only by fixing the problem of capitalism, although obviously it's one of the biggest problems. But there are many other angles that we need to work on at the same time. We could in a very communitarian way also commit environmental suicide. We could all collectively jump off the cliff, not just get the poor pushed off the cliff. That is also possible because there are many ways in which we are interacting with nature that we have not thought through, because of our, let us say, infatuation with modern technology, right? And a very narrow way of understanding its impacts.
In fact, there is a very interesting phrase which George Monbiot talks about, and it captures a lot of things that Sharat just talked about, which says that you should aim for private sufficiency and public luxury. Now, of course, interpretation of luxury and sufficiency is at the hands of many. But this is a very interesting statement to make, because what we are talking about is also about how politicians must think in terms of what I call distributing the investments that they make. So governments make investments in many things, but are we talking about investments for a few, or are we talking about investments which actually benefit the majority? And I think that's also an interesting point which will probably gel well in this particular discussion.
Can I quickly add something?
Sure.
So this question, so like Sharat sir was saying, this is not just about an economic model, but if you look at the localization movement that is happening right now, which also looks at local economies and local currencies, but there is a whole additional set of principles that looks at growing your own food, disengaging from the materialistic globalized consumption market as much as you can, investing more and more of your time and energy and efforts into your local communities. This kind of living and leading a more and more local life can be something that actually leads to this, material prosperity and more sustainable living together. And since this question was directed at Ashish, I would also like people to look at his work with Vikalp Sangam, which is available freely, where he has where like the team has documented a whole lot of examples of localized examples where people have actually managed to create communities and movements where there is livelihood creation, economic prosperity and stability, security, food security, and sustainable development, all of which is happening hand in hand.
Great. Thanks, Srushti.
The next is an observation that someone from the audience has shared. They say that most of the countries who have made a transition, who are economic powers, have been colonizers in the past. The wealth that they have is a result of the exploitation from their colonies. And India now cannot imagine economic growth that high in the present state. Gurudas sir, what do you think about this?
Colonization explains the wealth of a lot of nations. It's the simple concept of colonization, and that had its roots in mercantilist thought, economic thought, and which was a precursor to Adam Smith's economy, right? And mercantilists said that as long as you are able to bring in the wealth, the real natural resource wealth from other nations into your nation, you can be wealthy, and that's how they started becoming colonies. So colonizers actually have built upon not just ecological resources, not just natural resources from other countries, but also human labor, slavery. Yeah. So slavery is a very big input to the colonizers' economy. So that's absolutely right.
There's another comment from the audience that we must read out. It starts with a question of sorts. Do we have natural energy resources left to support this accelerating economic approach? It is proven that petroleum is now left only for the next 40 years and coal for the next 500 years. We are at a tipping point and irreversible damaging point on carbon emissions. On top of that, we are transforming one energy resource into another, conveniently calling it as green energy, forgetting about the transmission losses. This was just a comment.
Just a comment, right?
Yeah. This was just a comment. If anyone wants to say anything about this.
Yeah, I think a lot of things are fairly straightforward, and there are that's what is happening right today. Yeah. So I mean, there is no further specific comment on this, but the point I want to make is it's a good thing that we see people thinking about this whole thing and contributing to this conversation.
The next question is, are the economists aware of the threat to the planet and human species in the next 50 years due to the focus only on economy? And if they are, why are they not trying to move the needle?
I'm sure anybody, Ajay, Gurudas could also answer this question. Gurudas, you want to take first crack at this?
Yeah. So the question is: are economists aware that that the planet is under threat? Is it?
Yeah. Human species and planet both are under threat due to the focus on economy, and even then, why are we not moving the needle? Why are they not moving the needle?
Anybody who has done basic schooling is aware of this fact. You don't have to have economics education at all. Now, the point is, are they bringing this fact into their way of thinking? That is what is being questioned by the person who's asked the question. And obviously, the answer is a resounding no. I mean, for ages, we have seen that economists have not brought the planet into the thinking of the growth. And like just now, we argued about degrowth. Growth is just a number. Growth and development have historically not been taken away by the economists. It's just very recently that economists are saying that growth is quantitative and development is qualitative. Now, this is something which should have happened long back. And that's the reason why I'm saying, yeah, I mean, of course, every economist knows that the planet is under threat. And of course, they know what climate change is all about. Do they want to agree to that? Is the question that we're discussing here.
And maybe even going beyond that, is there blind adherence to their, shall we say, set of assumptions and
and beliefs,
making them either blind to the problem or sanguine that all those problems can be somehow incorporated into their model and solved through their model.
Exactly.
And that we can decouple GDP growth from environmental impacts. We can have GDP growth still at 15%, while the environmental impact is, material throughput is stabilized and environmental impact is reduced to zero. So, if you just make a transition to renewable energies, then, which will happen, we just need to invest in some technologies and everything will fall in place. So we don't have to question ideas of consumption and so on. So these are all very strong ideological positions that have been, brainwashed into modern day economic thinking. Not the case, say, 100 years ago. Right?
Yeah, fortunately, there are very small things that are happening, and I mean, if those movements really pick up within the political system, even while they are there at the level of some of the government bodies themselves, are in the area of natural resource accounting. And if you really see, GDP measure is like saying that I measure by my success of a business purely by revenue. I don't care if I make profits or not, which means if I don't care about the costs and I say that my business is successful because of the revenue, my business is not going to be there after a little while, right? Even in the classical capitalistic system. And GDP actually essentially says that I'm measuring only revenue side, right? I'm not measuring cost. And slowly, I think people are hopefully realizing that there is some problem here. And there is a need to also look at things like natural resource depletion, and which essentially is the cost to the economy and cost to the nation, even if you talk about national boundaries. So that is something, if it actually catches mainstream very quickly, I think that hopefully this number, it's ultimately it is said that what we measure is what we manage, and if we are not measuring the right thing, we will not manage the right thing. And therefore, if the economists continue to measure only the GDP growth, it is very clear that they will never manage this whole idea of development.
And I think the resounding answer to does an economist know of this is the fact that when Simon Kuznets gave the world the GDP measure in the 1944 Bretton Woods conference, he made sure that he said that in front of John Maynard Keynes, that this has got a very limited scope and this is to be used only while coming out of the Great Depression. But total disregard to what he had said at that time, we keep using it as something which is sacrosanct. It has to be done.
Right.
This is about natural resource valuation. How does one add in the economic growth analysis the contribution of biodiversity, genetic biodiversity of all biological resources?
So there is a short answer and a long answer, or shall we say a answer in a narrow sense, and then there is a wider answer. I think to answer that question directly is to assume that we want to really sit and measure GDP in a more correct way and so on and so forth. But we need to challenge that question itself. Why are we even measuring GDP in the first place, right? And if it's not a good indicator of anything, we might as well drop it and directly measure people's well-being in whatever way we can, and then worry about the role of biodiversity and so on and so forth. So I think that's the long answer. The short answer is that people have tried various ways, and I think Ajay mentioned one of them, which is natural resource accounting, as a way of incorporating these missing elements in the measurement of GDP growth, both growth or decline. People have done that, and people will continue to do that. It's a bit of a cottage industry in environmental economics as to how we can tweak the numbers. But there is, I think, a much larger question, really. Do we want to even fall prey to this idea that somehow we have to fix that indicator? Once that indicator is fixed, then we can continue to use that indicator to measure where we are going, or how well off we are, or how societal well-being is actually performing. And I think that is the one that really needs to be questioned. And biodiversity is also a very fuzzy concept. It has many dimensions to it. The genetic material is only one very narrow aspect of it. We don't say we should save tigers because of their genetic material. We say we should save the tiger because it has a certain spiritual, iconic, or aesthetic value to us. And so many species with which we attach religious, spiritual, or other kinds of values which have nothing to do with their genetic material. So one of the problems with the biodiversity conservation groups has been that they have tried to combine everything into the idea of biodiversity. Wildlife is also biodiversity, and genetic material is also biodiversity, and just a stand of trees is also biodiversity, and so on and so forth, and kind of actually led to more confusion. So when somebody says, I want to conserve biodiversity, it's not clear what exactly they are trying to conserve. And the hope has been, this confusion we'll achieve our goals. But I don't know if that's really who's confusing whom in this whole process. So that is a sort of an aside on this question. But we should really ask whether we want to spend our lives trying to fix the problems with GDP, or really drop the whole thing and focus on the larger question of what is well-being.
And I think one of the biggest problems of neoclassical economics is that anything which does not have a market value cannot be accounted for. And a lot of biodiversity does not have any market value at all. It has got an intrinsic value. And how are you going to get an intrinsic value into economic accounting? That's a question which has not been answered successfully by any economist till today. So the accounting principle which the economists used is very, very limited to monetary economics and market values. Non-market values, impossible. What is the value of a river flowing? A viral Vanara Nadichi kai value hai? It cannot be captured in market economics.
The next question is again about natural resource valuation. Is the idea of internalizing the ecological linkages through pricing entirely by tweaking economic theories alone workable? He is quoting back what you had mentioned, that as you said, we are nowhere near there and there are no signs we are moving closer to that goal. What are the possibilities for our democracies to address the transformation needed? Isn't going in the direction of a green economy or society unrealistic expectation unless politics, culture, and society internalize these concerns as much or more as economic theory?
Well, I guess the questioner has answered the question herself or himself. That yes, we need those multiple transitions in order to make the economic transition. It will not happen only on its own. But it means different people fighting on different fronts toward keeping this larger, multidimensional, multi-causal understanding in mind. So I think the person has answered their own question in some sense.
Okay, so the question is for Gurudas sir. Can consumption lead to real prosperity?
Can consumption lead to real prosperity?
In fact, there is a follow-on question to this. Of course, this is a question, but it specifically asks a few things. So isn't consumerism playing a role in the economy and the GDP? Is it possible to work at this basic level with consumers to make them understand the needs and wants which can possibly have positive effect on the environment? That's the whole question.
Yeah, so again, can consumption lead to real prosperity? Both of these we need to define. When you say consumption of what? And prosperity of whom and prosperity of what? And so again, it all boils down to the fact that till today, we have been talking about prosperity by a monetary value. And the monetary value always will increase if the consumption is increasing, because the economic engines keeps rolling faster and faster. And thus, if the consumption goes up, the traditional meaning, the economic meaning of prosperity increases. Yes, but there's a caveat to it, or there are two caveats to it. Caveat number one is the prosperity of not everybody increases. So the prosperity of some people increase very fast. Prosperity of some people increase relatively slower, and prosperity of some people can actually decrease. So if the economic value, if the GDP is capturing the prosperity of a few people, then we see it as increasing by consumption. But prosperity of a lot of people can decrease in that. So that is caveat number one. Caveat number two is, as consumption goes up, the use of natural resource goes up. So the non-renewable resources are consumed faster and the renewable resources are polluted faster. So when we are saying that the economic value of prosperity goes up, we are implying that it's fine to consume the non-renewable resources faster, and it is fine to pollute the non-renewable resources faster, which means that we have to re-question what we mean by prosperity and what should be the minimum prosperity level for everybody in society. Right? So without answering these questions, you cannot say in the non-traditional economic, prosperity means a quality of life which is equally distributed amongst all the society, and it's not talking entirely about the material quality of life, but it is talking about the qualitative aspects of life. And if we define prosperity in that way, then of course the answer is no. Consumerism or consumption will never increase prosperity of that kind, which is non-material kind.
I have one question which talks about keeping international relevance. So the question is for Sharath sir. If we, that is India, looks at development not as GDP or economic growth, but as other aspects too, but how can we sustain international relations in case there is a tough situation? What rivalry with China and Pakistan?
Well, this is your perennial question about, the immediate dangers and the long-term benefits of, it's sort of like saying, well, Gandhiji said we should not have an army at all, and the next day we had to have a battle with the neighbor, and therefore the whole idea of an army became justified. So I think without becoming completely impractical, the question is not whether today we want to do away with the army completely, but the question is also to step back and look at, are we locked into an arms race that has no meaning whatsoever? And to what extent is the arms race a creation of just this thought that, oh, we have to be superior to our neighbors and we have to have a better army and so on and so forth, and they are constantly at our throats, and therefore we have to be at their throats and engage in this competitive arms race, right? And these are not easy questions, obviously, because it's not a given that the whole world subscribes to similar ideas of whatever it might be. Although societies may subscribe, but the persons in political power may not subscribe, and they may use antagonisms for their own individual end. So that's a constant challenge. How can I be pragmatic? Should I put a lock on my door, or should I leave my door open, saying that dunya sab achhi hai and everybody's white-minded? But the question is, from putting a simple lock on the door, when I put up massive fences with the barbed wire on top and a 24/7 watchman at the gate, I'm crossing all limits of reasonableness in most situations, right? And I'm perpetuating certain ideas about security, insecurity that will influence many other people also to start thinking in the same way. I think that those are the kinds of difficult questions that we have to ask ourselves, whether it's at home and the barbed wire or in the international context, the same question.
I do understand in Europe, there are few nations who were trying to have no army kind of thing, like, small nations. So is it really possible for us, India, having a neighbors as China and Pakistan? Is it possible?
If you had a free borders policy, for instance, in a sense, the idea of nationhood would slowly dissolve. You would not have to draw these hard boundaries. A lot of people have mooted, for example, the person who passed away recently, Swami Agnivesh, many years ago, they had written the proposal for a South Asia level equivalent of the European economy, European community, right? Where you don't need passports to go across borders, where there is complete sharing of, having cultural ties, economic ties, and movement of people. That is a proposal that one should be thinking about, at least.
So that is possible.
Not the opposite. Yeah, it's possible.
But very slow. It will take time, right? It will take a lot of time.
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
I think we are done with all the questions now. We would like to invite you for our next session, which is planned between 7 p.m. and 9 p.m. on October 29, with our eminent panel, which will be anchored by Shripad Dharmadhikari. The subject for the next discussion is why are rivers dying and wells drying? Shripad will be joined by Dr. Aditi Mukherjee, Shri Manoj Mishra, and Srimati Kalpanatai Sarunkhe. And the session will revolve around all water issues. So see you on October 29, Thursday at 7 p.m. Bye for now.